Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar, Breaking the Bottleneck, 5 Ways to Improve Collaborative Creative Work. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Gegan, I'm the coordinator here at Custom, which is Digiday's creative content agency, and I will be your moderator today. Today's webinar is presented by our partner Hightail. Hightail aims to free the world's creativity, making creative collaboration more intuitive and accessible. As the company that helps creative professionals share their large video, design, artwork, photography, and presentation files for more than a decade, Hightail is uniquely positioned to solve the problems of creative collaboration. Having seen files labeled everything from V1 to V12 being sent back and forth, they knew there needed to be an easier way to share ideas, collect feedback, and get to that final version. We're joined by Mike Trigg, Hightail's COO. Mike's mission is to make the creative process easy and painless. Previously, Mike has founded several startups and led marketing at the international social networking site High5 and marketing automation vendor Epiphany. Mike has been on both sides of the agency-client conversation. He's going to break down the most common points of failure and offer solutions for improving your collaborative creative process. He'll teach us how to recognize signs of a creative bottleneck, why it's important to establish a strong creative process at the beginning of a relationship, how to improve communication, and how to start truly collaborating with your extended teams of agencies, freelancers, clients, and more. A question and answer period will follow, so please stay through to the end. And feel free to submit your questions at any time via the GoToWebinar panel, and we will do our best to make sure we get to all of them at the end. Everyone who registered for today's webinar will receive an email with a link to the recording of the session, so stay tuned for that. And finally, if you're live tweeting along with us today, please use the hashtag #CreateBetter. All right, with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Mike, take it away.
Great, thanks, and thanks so much for everybody joining us today. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. As Joe mentioned, I'm the COO at Hightail, but I've been in the marketing profession most of my career, doing marketing, product management, and have done every kind of creative project you could imagine, from TV commercials and websites to 3D animation and music production, even stretching my career. So I've lived firsthand the challenges around collaboration on creative assets and creative teams, and wanted to share some of those experiences as well as the experiences that our customers at Hightail have and challenges that they face and how they solve those to make their creative collaboration process work better. So one thing that I think really gets heads nodding is to talk about how much the challenge has arisen for marketing professionals in the last several years around all the different channels they need to support. I call this the creative crunch. If you think about the marketing challenge and the channels over which marketers need to interact with their customers, from blogs and email and web and social and so on and so forth, and all the assets that need to be created to go across all those channels, images, infographics, charts, landers, ad units, you name it, all this creative content needs to be produced, and you get this combinatorial effect where you need to produce those assets across all the different channels, all the different media types that you interact with your customers upon. I call this the creative crunch. It is a huge challenge in a lot of organizations where the creative timetable has really shrunk from what used to be quarters or months down to days or even hours in a lot of organizations. The phrase that I hear so many people use, and I use it myself with our marketing team at Hightail, is feeding the beast. So there's a huge amount of kind of insatiable appetite by all those channels, all the marketing managers across all those channels, and the demand that places on your creative team to produce visual assets at a rapid pace is really just increasing more and more. Many organizations today execute what they call content marketing. In fact, 86% of marketers are doing content marketing, not just in consumer products and consumer marketing, but B2B marketing as well, are placing huge demands on the creative output of an organization. Content Marketing Institute did some research on this, and they found that 40% of marketers publish new content multiple times per week. So again, that shrinking window of producing creative assets is a real challenge at a lot of organizations. And 60% of B2B marketers said that producing engaging content is a top challenge for them, and 39% of B2C marketers said that producing, the appropriate variety of content is a big challenge for them. So lots of demands being placed on the modern marketing organization to keep up with that beast that needs to be constantly fed. And if you think about what's sort of happened as a consequence of that, the creative pipeline has really become the bottleneck, the choke point for the rest of your marketing execution. All your email campaigns and your online campaigns and your social campaigns are really throttled by your ability to continuously produce high quality output, creative content on very short cycles. And so this has really, I think, come to a head in a lot of marketing organizations that are realizing that maybe investments that they've made in other areas of their marketing technology to do a better job of social marketing, content marketing, et cetera, that they've exacerbated this problem and created this content bottleneck that they're really trying to get around. So a lot of marketing teams, frankly, feel like they're drowning. An overwhelmed sensation is very common. Again, oftentimes you'll get that violent head nods that they're just sort of overwhelmed by the amount of content they need to produce, and it's falling on what is oftentimes a small internal creative team. And the challenge is a lot of CMOs are saying, we need to do even more of this. Again, in this CMI survey, they found 73% of marketers expect to produce more content in 2017 versus 2016. So this problem's only getting worse, and it's forcing creative teams to come up with new ways of solving it and feeding that beast. So what happens, and kind of the first knee-jerk reaction as the demands go up and up and up, is we need more people. There's kind of this myth that a marketing department is this internal insular group outside of the marketing team. But the reality at most organizations is that their marketing team is really an extended organization, supplemented not only with internal hires, but with external creative agencies, freelancers, people who might work on your blog, your PR, designers, video and photography production, visual designers, social media consultants, you name it. All these, it sort of takes a village, if you will. All these different people are brought in for the various creative projects. And this is great. It can help supplement your internal team, but it also can create some real problems. I, as a marketing leader, am oftentimes feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the number of worker bees running around on various different projects. There's frequently numerous things in flight, from new web pages to new ad layouts, etc. And the surprising thing, this was in a survey by CMO Council, only 27% of marketers have a process in place to aggregate, organize, and manage their visual assets across that extended team. So what you kind of get in the absence of that creative, established creative process is, frankly, sometimes a little bit of chaos, where a lot of projects are in flight. It's difficult to keep track of how they're progressing. It's difficult to enforce brand continuity across all the different initiatives that you have underway. It's difficult to know, which projects are running late, how projects that have dependencies on each other are going to converge on a launch date or a new campaign or whatever you might be doing. So huge organizational challenge that a lot of marketing departments and the creative agencies, ad agencies that support them face. And there is a real consequence of this. Hightail commissioned a survey asking about 500 creative and marketing professionals if they've missed a project, had a project either go late or over budget in the last year, and a full third said they had. It's a real problem. The amount of content that needs to be produced, leads teams to overcommit to what they can meet, and that chaos factor causes a lot of projects to be late or over budget. And some research by IBM and Standish Group found that for app projects, websites and mobile apps and things of that nature, that late rate or over budget rate was even higher. 44% of those projects were late or over budget or incomplete. 60% of them didn't meet their objectives that were stated as the original impetus for the project, which is pretty amazing. And nearly a full quarter just failed entirely. The project either got shut down or just was discontinued. So that is a huge challenge, a huge waste of money and effort and time in a lot of organizations that are trying to produce creative content. So, what is causing this? This is the third, cry for help. What we found in our survey is we asked folks if they had an effective creative process, and 75% of respondents really didn't feel that they had an effective creative process in their organization. It wasn't established, it wasn't articulated, there wasn't a system, a record to help them manage that creative process. It was goat herding, and that is a huge problem. It makes it very frustrating for your creative team, frustrating for your key stakeholders, whether those are your internal clients or external clients. And so managing that creative process is a big challenge. So, why is this so hard? I think there's a sentiment probably from a lot of folks that, well, it just is. Creative projects are messy, they're unpredictable, it's hard to know, when creative inspiration is going to strike, or what the client will like, and so they're inherently challenging. But I think if you look at it, there are a number of factors that really exacerbate the challenge of bringing creative projects to market. A first big one is miscommunication, and this is particularly the case when you've got sort of a client-agency relationship that can increase that communication gap. But it's also highly related to the systems that you use for managing the creative process. In the same survey that we commissioned that I mentioned earlier, we found that email remains the dominant medium over which creative teams gather feedback. They send it out via email and they say, what do you think? So nearly 2/3 use email as their main way of getting feedback, but only 30% of respondents felt that email is an effective medium for getting feedback or frankly providing feedback. And I certainly can relate to that personally. If I think about my inbox, it's often overwhelmed with hundreds of messages each day. I could call it a dumpster fire at times. And digging into that, inbox to find the different things that you need to be providing feedback on as a reviewer or approver is a huge challenge. So what happens is you get this proliferation. Meetings get set up, online meetings or in-person meetings. People start spilling over into other enterprise collaboration tools to get out of email, things like Slack or HipChat, and it just spreads the problem out even more. All of these different systems provide, yet another medium through which the review and approval process takes place. And so while they start with the best of intentions, they oftentimes exacerbate the problem. And, frankly, all these tools are really communication tools. They aren't really designed for providing feedback, especially on visual assets. So you lose context, you lose, you have to go into an email or other medium and specify the timestamp and what frame of the image you're providing your comments on, and that's a real hassle. It can create such a hassle for your reviewers that they, oftentimes don't provide their feedback in a timely manner. So those tools are a real problem, and I think within your organizations, if there are a few things you can look for that can be indicators of a communication breakdown. A big one is just these sort of organizational barriers that you sometimes have. We try to work with external creative teams as a true extension of our organization, which is oftentimes the case, but there is that reality of that client-agency relationship, and that can cause not totally transparent communication between the two entities. The problem I just described of feedback and review and comments being, fractured across multiple different systems, email, project management tool, whatever it might be. And just that lack of transparency. I think that oftentimes if you find yourself in meetings where you're saying, we can't say this, or we shouldn't say that, or we should position that this way, rather than, trying to provide candid, honest communication, that can be a sign that you've got a brewing miscommunication problem within your creative team as well. All right, so in addition to miscommunication, another big challenge, particularly in the agency-client relationship, is misalignment around goals and objectives of creative projects. there was a really interesting survey commissioned by an independent agency, RPA, and published in Fast Code Create and USA Today, that talked about some of that misalignment that you see. And there's some pretty startling discrepancies here, where clients versus agencies responded very differently on some of these criteria. Can we speak our mind freely? Clients saying, much more apt to say yes than agencies, who feel oftentimes stifled to state what they think is good and what they think is on target. Driving sales and understanding the business, a big discrepancy. Agencies think they're much better at this than their clients do. And then, at the end of the day, the most important one perhaps is demonstrating ROI. Agencies feel that they are good at doing that. 76% said they're good at doing that. Only 40% of clients agree and feel that their agencies are good at demonstrating ROI. And a lot of demonstrating ROI really depends on that creative efficiency. How much output are you giving to your client for the dollar that they spend? That sometimes feels like a crass way to measure creativity, but it's important. I think for a lot of clients, they're looking at that and really trying to evaluate that and measure that. And a broken creative process can really cause that ROI discrepancy to really rear its head. So some of the signs of misalignment, I think a big one starts with the vision around creative assets in a particular project. How do you get that alignment around creative vision, and who is really driving the creative vision? Is it more on the client side or the agency side? Ambiguous or unclear business objectives is really important. That is another, sure sign that a project could be in trouble if you don't know what the objectives of that creative asset are. And, at the end of the day, what are the success criteria? If you produce a new piece of content, how do you know if it's good or not? How do you know if it was worthwhile or not? How do you know if it was successful or not? So some of those things can be, those misalignment problems, if they're not articulated and communicated early in the process, can be real hindrances late in the game and, be the kinds of things that lead to a client-agency split. And then, a third area that really challenges a lot of creative teams and creative projects is, just at the end of the day, a poor process. And that is, really evident, again, in this survey that we commissioned. We asked folks, well, why do you miss deadlines or run late? And the number one thing they said was poor project management. The number two was unclear client feedback. So these become, I think, great indicators of that ROI metric that the client is always looking for. If they don't feel like their project is managed and the milestones hit and that it feels chaotic to them, that's a huge reason for them to question whether they should continue that relationship. And this goes back to, again, the lack of organizations having a clear creative process in place. And one of the areas where that pain is probably felt most acutely is around approvals. 86% of the people we surveyed said that they had difficulty getting final approval on a project. And that's not just at the final stage. Oftentimes the milestones are just as important in terms of hitting a timetable and launching on time. If a client or other stakeholder doesn't provide review and feedback in a timely manner, it can really cause the entire timetable to slip and the completion of the asset to slip. So this is a huge challenge, and a lot of organizations, both agency side and client side, don't have an approval system in place. So, in the worst case scenario, this can result in ambiguity over whether an asset was approved. And when you're on a really tight timetable and trying to launch something, and the client says, after it's out publicly on your website or on your social accounts, hey, we didn't approve that, it's important to have a audit trail that you can point back to and show that a particular piece of creative was approved and by whom and when. So, a couple signs of that poor process. I think there are oftentimes examples where you see this really unstructured feedback. I think that a key to a good creative process is being really clear with each of the phases and gates and milestones of a project. What are you trying to do? What kind of feedback are you trying to get? What are you trying to close off in terms of decisions or optionality for the creative project and creative direction? Articulating those milestones, the best agencies I've worked with have been really clear about what the milestones are and what they need from our organization in terms of timely review and approval. And the reality of that, or the help of that, is that if those milestones are missed, it has a clear consequence on the timetable of the project. And in particular, as I touched on, delayed approvals. This can be a real challenge. And frankly, back to the reality of it, if you're using email for that, emails just can get stuck in an inbox. And if it's a day or two deep into the queue of messages, then that can often result in a delay. So making sure that all the parties in the creative project know what they need to do and when they need to do it is really key. So enough about the problems. I think that's stuff that, again, probably many of you can relate to, but try to just articulate and quantify that challenge a little bit. The main thing we want to talk about is some tips for improving that creative collaboration process. How can you make this go more smoothly? And again, in particular, when you've got that agency-client dynamic, and that agency-client dynamic takes place whether the team is internal or external, frankly. The interactions between a creative team and the brand managers or marketing managers or VPs or CMOs is going to be similar. You're going to have an internal process on the creative team to discuss something and then share it more broadly. So some of the tips that we found at Hightail really work for us, and sharing some of our internal best practices as we produce content here at Hightail. A big one for us is frequent ideation. And so, this is the old adage of you never know when creativity is going to strike. And so we try to really facilitate creative inspiration through a number of different things. We'll put together sort of mood boards, one of which you see here, where you, not for us obviously, but an example of a mood board where you can provide these sort of visual assets. This is so key for getting that creative alignment early in a project when you've got reference work that you can all point to and say, yeah, this is what we have in mind, this is what we want this to look like. It can really do the work of 1,000 words in terms of articulating the direction that you want the creative project to go. But we also do, when we kick off creative projects, we try to be fairly diligent about doing creative brief. And there's a great blog post written by one of our marketing directors, Scott Moe, on the importance of a creative brief. It oftentimes gets skipped in the process, but spending that 30 minutes or an hour to put your thoughts on paper and share those with the team can really help uncover any potential misalignment early in the project. Make sure that everybody's clear on goals and objectives of the creative asset is really important as well. And then another practice that we do is we kind of have this almost incubation concept where we have an idea backlog that we keep. And a lot of the projects that we actually take on will surface out of that idea backlog. So we periodically will go and look at some of the ideas that have been thrown out there, but we haven't really advanced to the point of putting together a creative brief or a mood board or anything specific on it. And those can be kind of a parking lot for great ideas that we just don't have time to get to, but continue to feed that idea funnel. So a second important best practice, I call it contextual communication. So much communication around creative projects, again, happens in text-based mediums like email or chat. And that's not really a great place to have a conversation, especially around a video or an image or a CAD diagram or whatever it might be. You really need to have that conversation in context of the visual asset. And everybody, regardless of their level of technical astuteness or whether they're on your on the creative team, direct members of the creative team or not, it's got to be convenient for everybody to be able to get in, see what they're trying to provide feedback on, and provide specific feedback. So the ability to highlight exactly what you're talking about, exactly at which frame of the video or image, at exactly what timestamp in the video. That is super convenient and really accelerates your stakeholders' ability to provide feedback if they don't have to go in and say, where in an image they're referring to or what time in a video or audio file they're referring to. I think another really important best practice around communication is that it be consolidated. So this is back to if you have email and HipChat and a bunch of other things going, the creative team can kind of lose track of who's saying what, and the other providers of feedback don't see what each other is saying. And so consolidating that feedback into one place is really important. And then I think having it accountable. You want to make sure that you know who's weighing in and that they know they need to weigh in at a stage in the project. That can be a real warning sign, I think, if you don't have a key stakeholder weighing in and at least looking at something as a work in progress. And if you don't have that sort of accountability from your extended creative team, that's when hiccups can happen later on in the process. All right, so another key reason that we talked about earlier for why creative projects slip is the feedback loop really, gets extended and it causes the entire project time frame to slip. So having tools and procedures in place to make sure that you get that feedback in a timely fashion is really important. And one of the things that we try to do is really sort of assign the feedback, if you will. I think a challenge or a mistake that a lot of creative leads make is they'll have a draft of their concept and they kind of throw it over the wall. They'll send it out to a dozen people and they'll say essentially, what do you think? And that has a real challenge for the feedback team because nobody really feels like it's been assigned to them. Oftentimes you'll hear crickets as the creative team and nobody's really, taking the option to weigh in. It's really important that that team know and those individuals know that, a feedback loop has been assigned to you and you need to do it by X date or the project's going to move on without you. Making sure that feedback is attributed so you know who it comes from and that it's coming in real time so you can kind of have that awareness as feedback and comments kind of come in. That can really be a helpful catalyst for getting the feedback that you need. If other reviewers see that, John, Sally, and Susie have all already weighed in, that kind of gives them the impetus to recognize that they got to get on it and get in there and provide their comments as well. And then another really important thing around the feedback process is to make sure that it be closed loop. And by this, what I mean is oftentimes creative teams, especially if they send something out for a wide group for review and approval, they'll get a bunch of different comments back. And a mistake that is often made is comments that maybe feel, that they disagree with or feel out of left field, sometimes just get ignored. And that can be really frustrating for a reviewer. They might feel like their feedback isn't being heard. And I think closing the loop with everyone you're soliciting feedback from is really important to make sure that they know that the feedback was heard and was acknowledged, even if it's not necessarily going to be incorporated in the next round of the asset. All right, another one here. Again, we talked about it in the problem phase and what is the solution? Getting approvals. You got to make this as convenient as possible for your stakeholders. I think creative teams sometimes they're immersed in their creative project, and so it's the most important thing on their day. But the person that they're trying to get review and approval from oftentimes has 50 other things on his or her plate and may not, have this as a high priority. And oftentimes, even if it is a high priority, they might be missing some of the context for providing that approval. So having your approval be contextual is really critical. I like to, when I am asked for sort of a final review, to be able to see prior versions of that asset and how it progressed, and that gives me the context I need to know, okay, here was the feedback that was provided. I can see that the final version of this asset has that incorporated, and it makes it really easy for me to provide my approval at that point. It's also important to have the context of who has already reviewed and approved this, right? So as you go up the approval chain, making sure that your CMO knows that your VP of marketing has already approved it and that the account manager at your agency has already approved it. That's really helpful as well because it gives that blessing, gives you greater confidence that you can sign off because it's been already signed off by people within your organization. Having approvals be milestone-based. So, again, too often I think creative teams kind of keep their work under wraps until it's quote-unquote ready. And when a stakeholder only sees something at the end, it can be very difficult to provide approval because they haven't kind of tracked it along the way. So we try to make sure that key milestones in a creative project, like when you're signing off on a creative direction or whatever it might be, are explicitly approved from the key stakeholders so that they are signing off on the direction of the project before it gets too far down the road. Approvals obviously need to be directed. Who needs to approve and what is their status of approval. If somebody in an organization might be more of an influencer type of role, they might not get sort of veto authority, and so their lack of approval might be something that can be overruled. But just making sure that everybody, that the approval process is directed and everybody knows who needs to sign off. And then, of course, it'd be documented. As I mentioned before, the worst case scenario, a lot of agencies is, the client says this was never approved and we're not going to pay for it, or we did a big ad buy on something that you shouldn't have run. So having that documented approval chain can be really important in those instances as well. And then, finally, last but not least, what are the tools that you use for enabling that creative collaboration process? You'd never dream of not providing your creative team with, Adobe Creative Suite, Sketch, whatever they need for authoring or editing that asset. And similarly, you need tools in place for ensuring that your collaboration, review, and approval process goes smoothly as well. And, a couple of things that we think are important to look for here are, first, that it be intuitive. I think one of the biggest frustrations you hear, especially from senior stakeholders, is they just don't know what to do when they get pulled into the tool, and it can be confusing and difficult for them to know how to give their review and give their approval. It's got to be accessible, obviously, on mobile devices, tablets, etc. Got to be multimedia. So, if you're a CMO, you don't just work on video or just work on web or just work on audio or display or anything else. You need to have a common review and approval platform across all the different media types that you do in your organization. And then, importantly, you need to establish, I think, a system of record. I think that is really helpful, again, for a more senior stakeholder who, when they go into their email, they're going to be overwhelmed by the amount of stuff in there. And if they know they have a consistent place to go to where everything they need to do is tracked and documented and easily available, they're going to get in the habit of checking that. So definitely recognize and know and acknowledge from our own experience, even using our own tool, the creative collaboration process can be really hard. Because it's not just about creating an asset. The messy part is really when all the different stakeholders need to review and provide feedback and weigh in and approve and everything else that's involved in getting a creative asset from concept to completion. And that's, really what Hightail set out to do. Our product provides a way that creative teams can not only share files easily, huge files, videos, images, whatever it might be, but do everything else associated with that file. Get feedback, track the tasks that need to be done in the next version, manage all the versions of that asset as it progresses, make it easy for folks to preview, images and stream video and audio, and make it easy to run your approval process. So Hightail really can be that system of record for your creative content to make sure that, it's all run smoothly and done on time. So with that, we wanted to leave some time for Q&A, and I see a few questions have already come in. Please feel free to submit those, and we'll get to a handful of them here. So it looks like the team. Leanna, are you on still? Maybe you could ask the questions, or I'll read them out. It looks like the Digiday team maybe lost their audio connection. So first question here is, how do you implement changes that are needed across multiple creative teams not under one roof? The not under one roof is increasingly the norm. I think that even within, Hightail, our creative team, we have 2 offices in the Bay Area. A lot of them work out of a different office. We have an extended, set of freelancers and folks that we work with as far away as New York and Ohio. So, one of the things that, again, is really helpful for those teams is to be able to, have that kind of digital workspace where the team can kind of come together. And within Hightail, we have a concept called space, where you can put digital assets, you can manage different versions, you can see all the comments, and everyone who's following that space gets updates as the project progresses. So it's really easy for everybody involved in the project, whether they're day-to-day, individual creatives, or whether they're, stakeholders who are only checking in on a project periodically, to know kind of exactly what's going on.
Hi, Mike. I think, yes, hi, sorry about that. Yep, just a slight technical difficulty. But sorry. The next question that came in here was, do you have any tips for effectively creating timelines for creative projects? Obviously, clients are always hoping for those hard dates, but as creative projects evolve, things shift around, and you discover new things as you go. So, any tips there?
Yeah, I do think establishing a timeline early in the process is a really important thing to do. As varied as different creative projects can be, there often is a similar kind of template to them. You sort of see a kickoff phase where ideas are batted around, and from that you come up with a couple different creative options. It's usually kind of phase one of the project. Phase two is when fleshing out some of those creative options and kind of picking a creative direction. And then phase three is usually, closing in on the version of the creative that you're going to work with, and maybe doing a couple iterations of that. And then finally, obviously, getting it finalized and approved. And, I think that is, if you keep it sort of high level like that, as a sort of three-phase project, it can be useful for the team to all agree on kind of the key dates and milestones of that, without it being overwhelming. I think if you have a 50-point Gantt chart of what all has to happen, there can be confusion about exactly where you are in the process. So I think timelines are important. I think if you can kind of keep them simple and relatively high level, at least for the key stakeholder and client, that can help make sure everyone's on the same page.
Great. So when you are getting that you're collecting that creative feedback, you're trying to stay on those timelines, and working with clients who maybe you have one point of contact, but there is multiple stakeholders involved, multiple decision makers, and sometimes feedback comes from leadership teams who aren't the ultimate decision makers or the person driving the creative decisions, but they still feel like they need to weigh in. So do you have any tips on maintaining some structure when collecting that feedback?
That's a huge challenge. I mean, one of the curse of, I think, every marketer is that everybody thinks they can do marketing, right? So you often have a lot of helpers, and there are definitely some methodologies around this. There's the RACI stuff, the reviewer, approver, commenter, influencer, whatever it stands for, I forget. But that kind of clear establishment of roles can be helpful if you've really got a lot of different stakeholders that you need to appease. It can be sometimes an awkward conversation, but I think a helpful one to have up front to sort of define what different people's roles are in the creative process, who has, kind of ultimate decision-making authority on the creative direction is really important, because everybody's going to have an opinion, right? And sometimes it is impossible to incorporate everybody's opinion without really stalling the project. So I think articulating that is really important. I think another key is, as I touched on in the prepared remarks, is just that closed loop. I think oftentimes, people might weigh in and they might recognize that, they aren't the ultimate decision maker, but if there's at least sort of an acknowledgement like, hey, I hear your feedback, good comments, but here's why we're not going to incorporate that, or here's why we're going a different direction. That is just, I think, helpful, because it doesn't make the reviewers feel like they were just, locked out of the process or stymied, or that their feedback wasn't heard. It recognizes and appreciates their contribution, but, explains why the project's going to move ahead maybe in a different direction. So those kinds of things I think can really help clarify those roles and make sure that you're moving it ahead well. Great.
So when it comes to making sure everyone is on the same page, from your creatives who may have totally different ideas in their head of how something might come together, to the people who may be the stakeholders involved that don't think as visually or are less involved in the creative process itself. Oftentimes we try to come back to this creative brief, right? You touched on it a bit. But what do you do when your clients, sort of either disregard the brief or they don't do a thorough job of completing it? Should the agency side of things be handling all of the creative briefs?
Yeah, I think that can be good and appropriate. And another, I think, important thing to do is be kind of clear about who the creative lead is, right? And give that person a fair amount of authority. There's a great book on the creative process by Ed Catmull at Pixar that you should read. But Pixar in their production of movies gives creative control clearly to the director. And even though the senior execs at Pixar, there's a group they call the Brain Trust, all weigh in on the movie and on the dailies and everything along all the stages along the way. There's a lot of feedback to be incorporated. The ultimate decision-making control is left to the director, and I think that can be important and useful even in little marketing projects. Is to say, okay, so and so is the creative lead on this, and that will help ensure the integrity of the work. I think sometimes projects can suffer from too much feedback, and they just kind of get muddied. They sort of lose their edge, and you don't want that. And so being real clear about who the creative quarterback is for a given project can be helpful as well.
Great. So we had a similar follow-up question from someone who works at marketing for a company and works with a small internal creative team. So a little bit different from the agency-client relationship, but effectively the same sort of thing where you're submitting briefs to your creative team and trying to get them to complete things on timelines that you're hoping to set out. So this person asks, how do we motivate our creative team to work on our timeline and ensure they are producing the content and routing edits in a timely manner instead of sort of, setting their own timelines based on when they think they can get to it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this can be a fractured relationship internally. Especially if organizations have sort of a shared services model where one creative team is sort of piled on from multiple marketing departments across a larger organization. I think that's a tough one to answer in the general. I think that I've seen some different practices work with that when that dynamic kind of comes up. One is to have the creative team sort of require, I guess, if you will, a creative brief to be put together or a project outline or request submitted. I think visibility into other projects can be really helpful. So, if the creative team is saying no, that is a harder answer to accept when you don't know as a marketing manager what other things are on their plate. And so looking at that is important. One of the things that we do with our internal design team, our creative team at Hightail, is, we kind of have a prioritization meeting that our VP of marketing and myself are in, where we look at those different projects and kind of agree on how they should be prioritized. I think that is really helpful to make sure that they are focused on the right stuff and aren't delaying projects, for other projects that may be lower priority. I think, sometimes you hit crunch modes where you do have a timetable that you need to hit. We oftentimes will do what I'm sure many of you do, which is turn to supplemental external resources. So if our team can't produce it in the timetable we need, we have sort of a group of independent, freelance designers and developers that we work with to supplement our internal team. And so we try to make sure that they, abide by the brand guidelines and other stuff that we've established. So the work that they do has, visual continuity with the work that our internal team does. So, I don't know that there's any silver bullet answer to that question, but, those are some thoughts on some of the things you might try.
Great. And a lot of people seem to be having this difficulty. It seems like this is sort of what everyone is here for, because we've had another question come in regarding assigning deadlines and then how to stay on task. So how do you assign deadlines for ongoing tasks? As the goalposts move and projects evolve over time, how do you make sure you stay on sort of keep a broad look at things and make sure you stay on task as things change? For example, this person says, our video team is constantly creating new videos, but we run into issues where one editor continues to deny a finished video, and this bleeds into other projects that need to be done and are also a priority. So what do you do when you find like sort of a single point of failure that's holding up a lot of other work?
Well, one thing you can do is, those sentiments can be, perception or reality, right? I think sometimes there might be a perception that may be fair or maybe unfair, that there's a particular individual or reviewer or decision maker that's a bottleneck. Having a system of record for your creative review and approval process definitely helps in that, right? Because that can, take things out of the realm of opinion or sentiment and into the realm of specific and clear and obvious to everyone, including that person who might be the bottleneck. So I think that, seeing a task or a project that's overdue in your to-do list, can be an obvious reminder and can be, frankly, the factual evidence that leads to hopefully a more productive and constructive conversation about how do we change this? How do we improve this? How do we make sure that this bottleneck doesn't exist? I think other things that can help with this are, and this statement sometimes is a little anathema to creative professionals, but is to adopt the kind of development, software development approach of a minimum viable product. Digital content today has a short shelf life, and you're not producing, unless you're producing a Super Bowl ad that you're spending a ton of money on the media side of it. A lot of these things are web pages or landers or social ads or whatever it might be, and getting them. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Oftentimes the important thing is to produce content in a timely fashion, and there can be time after the crunch period to go back and improve it, do a second version of it. That's easily done when you're dealing with digital media rather than print or conventional broadcast media. So I think recognizing that can help take a little of the pressure off the creative team, where they can get things done faster and not, again, let perfect be the enemy of the good.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your insights, Mike. I think we've got time for one more question. We've got a question about the platform. Is Hightail client-facing or just internal? And can you control and edit what your clients see in Hightail versus what your team is seeing?
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons a lot of people, especially on the agency side, use Hightail in the first place, is they want a system that they can share creative works with their client. It might be perfectly fine to use some sort of, file sharing system, which, Hightail can do this as well, enable a team to share, files internally. But really where it shines is that external feedback. A reviewer can come in, you can send them a link, share a link with them. They can provide their comments as a guest user. They don't need to register for the service if you don't want them to. You can have that discussion there. They can easily access it via mobile and other mediums. So it's really great for that external use case. And what we see with a lot of agencies is they kind of run both loops within Hightail. They'll have their internal team do a review and feedback process, and then when they're ready to kind of take that round out to their client, they'll push it out to the client, and there's a feature in the product that allows them to basically push that asset into a new space, a clean space that doesn't have the comments, doesn't have the discussion, doesn't have the past versions in it. It's kind of a fresh place for their client to provide feedback on exactly what they want to provide feedback on. There's another cool feature that designed for that a client presentation called presentation mode, where you can control a space and see who sees what, essentially drive it as almost a webinar style, but as a live application, so that your client can, go in and type comments and add, highlight things in the assets that they're seeing as you're presenting the work. So that's a really nice feature as well for that moment where you're doing that external client review.
Excellent. I think that's all of the time we have for today. So thank you so much, Mike, for all of your excellent insights. And of course, thank you to our partner Hightail, and thank all of you for joining us today. We hope you learned something. Keep an eye on your inboxes tomorrow for that link to the recording to watch this on demand and catch up on anything you might have missed. And yeah, thanks for joining us today. Please enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everybody.